distance, ce que la pandémie nous a appris. La vente à distance, ce que la pandémie nous a appris.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone. Now we're going to be proposing a virtual roundtable to describe in less than half hour a distance sales with the managing director of the Treasury and other key partners. In less than a minute, if I may, I'd like to ask them to please introduce themselves, even if you do know their outstanding journey and professional experience. So I have the honor to chair this table at a round table. So we're going to be around 3 points: the AID parameter, its regulatory scope and challenges. But let's start with its definition. So good evening. I know this is not the best timing to do on this roundtable, but let's try to be dynamic. And it is a very interesting roundtable and passionate. Let's start with Sébastien Sédot and Patrick Raffort. The parameter definition, can you describe very briefly? Please introduce yourself first, but can you please describe the parameter of distance sales and give us a right definition? Let's start with Sébastien or Patrick. Oh, Patrick, please, whoever wants to start. Well, Sébastien, please start. Okay, I'll take the floor in first. So thank you very much. Thank you, dear Michelle, for your presentation. I am the chief editor and delegate of the Insurance Magazine, which is the key media of the insurance sector in France. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for the Casablanca Insurance Meeting for having organized remotely this great event. On a topic that from March 20 to 21, it has become in a spotlight. So this theme have been followed by all of us very closely on the Argus. Distance sales has been a hot topic since the very beginning. So we have been able to measure all the interests and stakes of distance sales for all the stakeholders, and the impulse that distance sales have given to all of us. And how do we define distance sales and what its parameter? I will spare you the article of 2021 and 20 of the Consumption Code, but according to our interpretation or definition, it's not a legal one or regulatory one, but distance sales is primarily marketing of insurance products that are sold and marketed remotely without the physical presence of the insurer, the consumer, or the insured. So this distance sales or this mechanism and instruments required several remote modes: telephone, video conferences, through Teams, WebEx, and all other tools that you know. It's a distribution marketing channel that is quite popular. And it gives like a remote type of sales or correspondence type of sales. So this is pretty much the first definition that is quite obvious and down to earth. So as journalists, we have several questions that come to our minds. So where does the distance sales starts and stops? So when you look at the insurance sector in France and in other countries, the underwriting journey is like a kind of a journey. Does it start remotely Does it start? I am in VAD, or is it just sales marketing? So what are the borders, actually? And we need to adapt to the new distance sales, namely on some products like life insurance. This is a product that has a reputation to be sold easily, but it requires a face-to-face. And we have seen that for 2020, there has a drop in life insurance because a lot of agencies and life insurers have it closed down. And also, is it about contracts to define distance sales? Is it about agents and the client? Is it already known by the distributor? Is he already in a portfolio? Can we actually conclude a new contract by telephone? Is it really distance sales? So we might ask all these questions. And I will close with the following question on the definition. So there is not a single distance sales, but there are three ways to conduct distance sales: through distribution, and what we call the lead and the show prospect. For instance, a visitor that will fill in and log in to fill in a form, an insurance form online, and he's going to be called later on. I think this practice is not a question, but the second mode is the natural activity of the insurance and the distributor as a business as usual in their portfolio, and loyalty practice. And this practice is not under the spotlight and not very popular. And another aspect that is more problematic today, and I will let some room for other participants to answer, is the market consumers that we would attract without them really expressing the eagerness to be on the market or to have insurance systems. But the practices are not always that compliant sometimes. So thank you very much, Sébastien. Patrick Raffort, can you introduce yourself and tell us, for you, what is this definition parameter of the distance sales? Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to be even remotely in attendance with you. I'd like to greet our friends of the Moroccan Insurance and Reinsurance Federation. The definition that Sébastien had just made is quite good and very large and broad. In this field, as in other fields, we need to understand what are the stakes in terms of data, figures, parameters, etc. And we have seen that we have some hard time to limit or to figure out where it starts and where it stops. The principle that my colleague highlighted is that we have some non-competitional rules and also communication tools are standardized: telephone, video conference, etc., mobile telephone. And distance sales on the mobile phones, what we call the AM trade or marketing, in most countries account for almost 20% of communication tools. So coming back onto parameters, and that was a question asked before, on distance sales in a broader way, world figures, and this will allow you to better benchmark. At global level, in 2016, we were $1 billion of turnover and benefit. In 2020, $290 billion. So we have seen that with the sanitary crisis, it has an tremendous boost. We would have most probably $350 billion in terms of turnover. So in Europe, in 2019, we were at about 236 billion euros, with an increase rate that was quite significant of about 14%. And in 2020, the figures have just been shared. We will be around 720 billion euros in terms of turnover. In France, the national figures and data give us a quite precision and accuracy on figures, 130 billion euros. with an increase rate of 5%. And if we make a distinction between goods and services, we see that goods and assets have increased by 3%, services dropped by 5%, and on services, on travels and stays, we have a drop of about 50 to 60%. So what about insurance in all this landscape? Looking at all the literature that we can find out there, well, in the insurance market or affinity market, it is a very complicated sector to really come up with exact figures. Same with the distance sales. Looking at the figures we have and looking thoroughly on the marketing process and sales process that we have on the dashboard, we can consider that on the insurance part, we have about 14 billion euros that are not reported on the national figures. This is not e-commerce. Of course, we need to make a distinction between e-commerce with shots on the web and all the contractual relationships that are formalized and are not accounted for in the turnover of e-commerce. Now, we can say that we are in the field of insurance of at about 14 to 15 billion. And maybe we can consider that the borrower or the relationship between consumer and the borrower, even if there is a banking relationship, the relationship with the insurance is remote. The client will receive a proposition that has been maybe increased. And if he agrees, maybe he sends back some forms that have been properly filled in. And he can actually recourse to electronic signing. What Sébastien said earlier on, we are properly on distance sailing and sales, and we can bring into this category the figures I referred to earlier. And of course, there is a solicitation, but the conclusion or the agreement is not done with physical presence, but with electronic signature. And to close with, all distance sales that are done by telephone are under discussion and can be questioned sometimes. Thank you very much, Mr. Raffort. And I will in turn thank the Moroccan Federation of Insurance and Reinsurance. And I am so unhappy. Oh, it's a shame I'm not in Casablanca this time as we were in 2019. So can we now shift to the regulatory aspect before giving the floor to UNECOR? Can you actually describe us the regulatory limitations and constraints of distance sales, and what are the legal scope of enforcement? Thank you, Michael. Good evening to all of you. Good afternoon. I am from the BLB Consulting Office, which is a consulting office that assists insurance companies and brokers to help them to be compliant with the legislation and regulations. And Patrick spoke about FG2A. He is president of the FG2A, and I'd like to make his presentation and introduce him. Is the Federation of Insurance and Guarantees, bringing together 200 members in France. And to summarize in a couple of minutes the regulation of distance sales, it is very much complicated because much has been written about it in the newspapers. So we spoke about it over the last years, but we have the feeling that the situation is crystallized. So there's a lot of evolution and progress over the last years from the regulatory frameworks. So regulators have worked hard to set up the legal frameworks. But if we go back to the very start of distance sales, we see that there has been a progress from the legal standpoint. But the theme of this roundtable is the post-COVID time. It is interesting to see that COVID has allowed to make distance sales more credible. As before, associations and many other federations would challenge distances because there have had been some abuses, because distances in the insurance has been done regularly and progressively since last year, inspired by what was done in the past. And the most veterans of us will remember the door-to-door kind of sales for insurance contract signing. So this door-to-door has become virtual through call centers that used to be localized in France, but now it's also overseas. So over the last 15 years, the regulation has gone harder and tighter for the right reasons, by the way. And the purpose was to make sure not to hinder distance sales and allow the freedom to go for a contract. But COVID has allowed for remote or distance sales, but it has to remain possible after COVID. Now, going back to your question, and as Sebastien said earlier, I'm not going to go through all the articles of the code. It would be too burdenous for you. But in terms of clarification for the video's viewers of this roundtable, as you know, insurance brokers and intermediaries that want to distribute large products have to, according to the legislation, get a license with their countries or from their countries, from the what we call the National Institute that will allow you to register on a red list that will allow not to be called on cold or overnight from whatever activity. So for our viewers today, on who do not want to be solicited or requested, and you can go on the website, log in your telephone or fixed number, and we cannot call you because the insurance and company or broker has to get the license that will allow him to filter all the telephone numbers that he wishes to call, and this phone number that will be out or that will be listed as possible, available, and not on the red list, then the insurance company can reach out and contact that client. So that's the first filter that will allow the consumer not to be contacted or solicited. Of course, the legislator and regulators have allowed for the last week to reduce this possibility, because brokers have found the cost of the licenses or accreditations way too high. So now they're trying to make sure that all brokers who want to do distance sales need to do it with compliance with the standards, but with realistic costs. So sanctions are quite high if we go to contact a client without the red filters. So, but anyways, this, once it's done, most of the problems that we have seen on distance sales in France are what we call the cold calls. So now for now, we have some people who have not been solicited or requested to go for insurance. But once we have gone through the what we call the institute or hotel procedure, then the insurance company will call the consumer, and by law, he has to go through the tunnel, the underwriting tunnel. There are a lot of compulsory provisions and mentions that have to be well understood and make sure that the prospect and the consumer is duly informed on all this information and provided with all the details and different possibilities. So there are a lot of legal mentions and information that has to be said and shared. And now, of course, when the calls are recorded, and the law will compel to keep the recording, to keep the recording for 2 years. The recording needs to be kept for 2 years. So all this information needs to be given to consumer beforehand and for by the prospect consumer. After this channel or underwriting channel, we move to the agreement for an insurance contract, not that the person or consumer has solicited, but it will have been presented and offered. So that agreement or contract has to be done upon joint agreement since last July, and there's a new law under discussion that will be finalized in a couple of weeks, and the enforcement decree are expected by the summer to make sure that these sales is done into time. So we'll not be able to sell to a prospect overnight or cold selling to the consumer without actually recording for 24 hours the call. So the first call will have to give all the information to the consumer on the legal and all the products, on the legal aspects and all the legal, and the consumer will keep that information. He will be sent that information in PDF format, and once he gives his consent on agreement, he will have to sign the agreement or the contract by electronic signature. Thank you. I said in the very beginning that I was the keeper of time. I'm the Swiss watch here. I know that the regulatory explanations will be very lengthy. Well, I tried very hard to summarize and make it very brief without dwelling on the legal articles. But in a couple of few words, we have gone very far on distance sales, and now we are at a point where the market is well regulated, and we are tooled to make sure that operators comply both with and respect both the right of consumers, but also the right of underwriting remotely. And we have seen that during COVID, this is a very pertinent and very good tool. Thank you very much. Professor, can you tell us about the risks and opportunities and make your introduction, please? Thank you. So, Maître Lapointe, you have given him a mission impossible here to make a legal presentation in 20 minutes, or 2 minutes rather. He's done brilliantly. Well, I'm faced with the same mission impossible than my colleague, but I'm in charge of regulation of the insurance for the Treasury. It's the setting up of 2 rules and proposing law and draft laws and regulatory texts. There are quite many of them in the insurance sector, as well as the distribution of the insurance products. So this is also part of it. So in other words, this is the legal aspect is something that I do. These are my prerogatives. So the main risks going from, or rather talk about opportunities. Distance sales needs to be, well, as it is, a communication tool. And we have different channels, telephone, video conferencing, and the increasing use of distant mobiles and internet. But this should not be synonymous of kind of degraded sales. And it could be slippery if we do not use the tools properly and with high standards. And we have seen this during the early COVID times. We've had some degraded use of distance sales. On the use of distance and remote sales sometimes should drag along the adaptation of professionals and operations and operators, and even adapt the regulatory framework in order to protect the consumers, because sometimes at European level, the law has been increasingly in favor of consumers, both for internet sales and physical or e-commerce, whatever. These principles are absolutely a consensus between all EU countries and make sure that consumers are making the right and enlightened choice in all duty and moral conscience. Now, about the risks, in many cases, it is a consistent risk. And Maître Lapointe has said it. There has been some deviations, and it's still going on right now. There are some abuses, or rather situations that haven't been really compliant with the regulations and the laws. So the regulation has adapted and is continuing to do so. And the crystallization that we look forward to, hopefully the situation in the field will be crystallized and will vanish and properly managed. So as our responsibility as regulator is that the rules will hinder and prevent fraud and deviations. So, of course, there is the contractual and underwriting freedom, but we need to protect the consumers and his free choices. But what about the new challenges? I was talking about the problems. I have just surrounded them. I've just but I don't. This is outspoken actually, but in practice, there is a degradation of subjects. So, well, let's say that distance sales is not very professional. It actually complies with the regulation, but not really. So we have not adapted fully to this very unique distance sales. So we're not really very straightforward. And sometimes we go beyond the rules and standards. We are not seeking to comply and respect the laws and the consumers' rights. And sometimes there are really organized fraud, and distance sales they allows for that and efficient ways to actually fraud people. And problem touches the contractual information. So, to what extent the contractual information is disclosed to the client under the right conditions and sound conditions before, during, and after the signing of the contract, and also the consent. To what extent we have an enlightened consent and agreement. We're talking about insurance schemes here and products. It is a very complex product, isn't it? And by way of construction, really taking care of the quality of consent is a real issue in general, but and more particularly in the insurance sector. And this is what we are doing in our department. The CPR, the Prudential and Regulation National Authority that has worked extensively on the consumers' protection, and the DGCCR, which is the service department under the Ministry of Economy and Finance that is charged of the general control on the way things are sold in France, particularly in the insurance sector and particularly in distance sales. So there is a some of things and degradation of things. For instance, an email is sent with an internet link that gives access to documents. That is not enough. So we want to make sure that when people want their contract, they need to be able to have access to the right documents, and we need them to have the chance to read fully and understand. We have seen in a couple of months some people, namely restaurant owners, not to have opened their insurance contracts and not having read it fully, which is quite confusing. And in other words, we want to make sure that people have the document, take the chance to read it and time to read it. We don't want to challenge people and bother them, but it is important. So in terms of consent, There's more consent? Yes, why not? We need to make sure that consent is done on the terms of the contract and keep a trace. A word on opportunities. Could you please conclude on the opportunities? Data that have been shown show the momentum and dynamics and provide us clear evidence of a need and tangible opportunities. So we are finding out this new things because these new schemes, and we have seen that there are new means to do better what we did not used to do well on the telephone. So tools are growing, are being designed. So the awareness and stream of awareness is growing, and the crisis is a good opportunity for that. So there are clear opportunities of development out there, but these development opportunities ahead of us will depend on our collective capacities and professional capabilities as public powers to make sure that the regulation and the consumers' protection is not only a wishful thinking and a regulation obstacle, but a real, tangible practice in the field, regardless of the sales mode, whether irrespective of distance sales or not, and irrespective of the volumes of the sales. Thank you very much. So this is a new challenge of the sector in its daily marketing and promotion. Last part, as Niolet was saying, on challenges and opportunities.
So what we can say about this pandemic and the post-crisis phase is to see the change, radical change in behavior. We can see that a certain number of consumers have truly turned to e-commerce, to the internet, and to this remote relationship because they didn't have a choice. So the conclusions we can draw from all of this is that there's a major environmental and societal change, and there's another way of addressing the relationship and explicit demand. So the studies that we have produced, or those that we've been able to observe, whether they are French, European, or even international, have all revealed the same thing. They all reveal that they want to continue tapping into the internet, and they have realized that this mode of consumption, of interaction with the providers and of goods or services is interesting, and they do wish to pursue that. So marketplaces and e-commerce and this distance relationship will continue. They also wish to have greater proximity with local trade, and so this is where you see a convergence of the marketplace with the more involvement of local trade, which includes agencies or branches and banks, etc. We also see they need full digital services, which to date, I mean, the insurance segment business is lagging behind. I mean, we weren't necessarily in a full digital mode from the beginning to the end. And so today they wish to see this full digital approach, whether it is in the underwriting process or even for advisory. And Victor was talking about this. It's important to be increasingly present in the advisory phase. What's also important is transparency and seamlessness, but also the indemnification of claims. So this seamlessness needs to be available on end-to-end basis, and it's important for things to be transparent in terms of engagements. So we only have a few minutes left. So Sebastian, for you, so these new challenges, how would you describe them? So just in a nutshell. I think there is room for ethical, professional, and sustainable distance selling. For example, it's important to have this ethical, professional approach, and unfortunately, this is maybe where things were lagging behind. And we must nevertheless say that market professionals have shown good faith. So now the current legislation with the brokerage legal framework that has also been adapted, and now what remains to be seen is whether this is something that will truly be implemented, and we will see how long it will take for this everything to unfold. While we should also wonder whether there was maybe things weren't maybe a little too hasty. But maybe one of the answers to the challenge will lie in the strengthening of the oversight of the CTA. On the one hand, maybe the CPA needs to continue to strengthen this oversight of these telephone platforms that aren't necessarily hosted or in France. And so it's important to make sure that that all of the specifications, the regulatory specifications, are met. There's also the strengthening of the DGCRF and the sanctions, and this is something we've also discussed this year. These are a lot more stringent in terms of fines, and there's also the blocktail registration, and so this is something that was raised by Benoit. If I understood correctly, the government has made an effort on the cost of this membership for intermediaries, but as far as local brokerage, there has also been some progress made, and there's also this co-responsibility throughout the entire value chain, including the final distributor. And so, to conclude, we will give the floor to Lionel Cork, who will give us his version of it. So, what would you say about this? What does distance selling provide to this insurance landscape? So, distance selling is an ancillary tool that has been introduced over the recent years, and people today are used to working remotely, to consume remotely, and they will increasingly get used to purchasing remotely. So distance selling is the tool for the future. And in fact, I would like to thank the public authorities for not having prohibited distance selling, because these distance selling was supposed to be prohibited for insurance. And so thankfully, this is something that's very properly supervised. And however, today, the legislative rule of law allows supervisor, the market regulators, and market operators to ensure that these deviants, or to ensure that no deviants can cause damage. And so, to paraphrase the President Macron, it would be too bad to prevent the freedom of the majority to allow the minority to prevail. Lionel Cork, so what's the future for distance selling, according to you? So it seems that there's a bright future ahead, given what we are experiencing today. So what this landscape allowed us to see, to realize two things. So I'm not sure that the outlook is the same for the different types of distance selling and how things will unfold, given the risks and challenges that we raised earlier. So this will depend on how things will unfold on the ground and the reaction of the public authorities. If we see, for example, a phone soliciting and insurance, I'm not sure if there's a real bright future for telephone soliciting or phone marketing. And in fact, that's what Maître Lapointe was saying. This question that was raised is the prohibition of prospecting or phone telemarketing. And so the legislator chose, for example, to focus on energy. There were some prohibitions following some deviations, and so there was an attempt by the legislator, and so we do have a more balanced framework which aims to set a real framework. I'm not sure whether the public authorities are hasty to push things forward in this regard, given that we're already taking stock of this CCF, and we have already seen some attempts at embezzlement where sometimes there have been attempts to make sales of completely useless policies. And so this is a reality on the ground. I mean, we must admit that. And so if these types of practices, including with the new regulation that holds these people accountable, or rather fails to hold these people accountable, where everyone needs to take on their responsibilities, we have regulatory bodies that need to exercise their oversight, and we need to ensure that consumers aren't jeopardized and their interests aren't jeopardized. and the administration and the regulatory authorities all need to be held accountable, and rules need to be put in place that leave no room for abuse. So the future of telemarketing will truly depend on the way that things will be enforced, on the new tools that are provided to the supervisory authorities to be able to do their work, especially the recording of phone conversations, which is not necessarily done in the past. And this is what will dictate the future of these activities. And final point, and this references what Maître Lapointe was saying, these activities have repercussions on each other. I mean, we've had extensive debates at the Senate on the exact scope of the regulation on telemarketing. And so typically, based on the way that things could be said, it could go well beyond this telemarketing. This is the risk at hand. Not only those that will be involved in telemarketing will be on the poor end of the regulation, but generally will end up jeopardizing other telemarketing or distance selling activities that have nothing to do with these practices. And so these are the stakes that are, and so the future will truly depend on the professionals. So I didn't want to interrupt you because I would have loved to be able to continue this conversation. So I'd like to thank you all. But before, maybe just one final word to conclude. Just one word. Lionel. So what would you say distance selling is? Patrick's. I would say that is an incredible tool for the future. Thank you, Sebastian. It's a tool for professionals that should be used ethically. Maître Lapointe. I would say that it's a tool that has a great future ahead. And so we might have gone over for a few minutes, but we truly hope that we were able to shed some light on distance selling. We look forward to seeing you all next year in Casablanca for the Casablanca Insurance Meeting. So congratulations for this great organization. Thank you all.